This time we're looking at the Faithlife Study Bible. This is the printed edition. It's also available as an app and through Logos Bible software. This printed edition is in the NIV and it is by Zondervan. It's 2,264 pages. It's double columned. Each page is full color. So I'll run down a list of some of the people who contributed to the Faithlife Study Bible. Doug Stewart, Dwayne Garrett, Tim Keller, Carolyn Custis James, Daniel Block, Randy Alcorn, Craig Keener, Ed Stetzer, Michael Bird, N.T. Wright, John J. Collins, and it's edited by John Barry. And that's only a few. There are many, many more that contributed. Most of the notes in the actual text, though, are pulled from resources from Lexham, which is part of the Logos digital Bible study platform. So that is what you find culled together and combined into the study notes. You can't really pin down who's responsible for which individual note throughout the text. Something I really like about the notes in the Faithlife Study Bible are that the notes themselves are translation independent. What does that mean? Well, the notes in many study Bibles are based upon whatever translation or groups of translations that Bible is using, but the notes in the Faithlife Study Bible are actually based on the original languages. That's a really great concept, especially for a digital app-based study Bible. But the print edition, at least this one, like I said, is NIV. However, the notes throughout, they're not going to mention choices that the NIV translators make. They're going to mention notes pertaining to the original text. This just happens to be published in the NIV because it's the most popular English Bible translation, at least in North America. Now, the print version at the beginning, there's not a lot. You don't get a lot because, again, this is intended to be more of a digital study Bible, but the print version is for people who don't have access, maybe don't have internet access, or just people who prefer to have something that they can hold in their hands. There are a lot of people who are paper snobs. You know, they don't want to scroll and highlight and click around. They want to turn pages. They want to smell paper. They want to feel the weight of a book in their hands. So they made a print version. In the print version, after the page that lists the preface to the NIV and the contributors, it's a 4 or 5 page essay by Doug Stewart on how to study the Bible. Doug Stewart co-wrote with Gordon Fee How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. Then there's a short, very condensed timeline. There's an essay by Dwayne Garrett on the Pentateuch, and then we come to the introduction to Genesis. Now, the book intros in the Faithlife Study Bible are fairly short. They're not commentary level like some of the other we've seen, but they give you the relevant information about what you're going to find in the text. They give you a condensed timeline of the events that happen in the text. They give you a brief outline, very brief, and then some themes to look out for. The illustrations, here's an example from Genesis 1, and they're done really well. I'll show you a few other examples. Here's a cool one of wine presses in ancient Israel, what a wine press would have looked like, what ancient ships would have looked like back in the day. Here's a 2-page spread of Jesus's family tree based on Matthew's genealogy, the various coins that are mentioned in the Gospels. This is one of the synagogue Jesus preached at Capernaum. I've actually been to this synagogue, so you get a reconstruction and it helps you get basically the scope and the size. The illustrations are a mixture of this computer rendered graphics and then some more traditional illustration as well as typesetting and print. They're done really well throughout. At the end, you come to the NIV Concordance by Kohlenberger and then the color maps that you find standard in most study Bibles. This is not a red letter version, so the words of Jesus are in black, but in the notes themselves, notes that cover a range of passages, like a paragraph or a chapter, those notes are going to be in red over a white background, and then the other notes throughout are going to be in black, the notes that are just on verses or particular words or phrases. Throughout the notes in both the Old and the New Testament, there are word studies. They don't actually show you the Hebrew text, but there's a word study on the Hebrew word bara, which means to create. So very helpful. Probably not as many, at least that I've seen, as in, say, the CSB Study Bible or the Cultural Background Study Bible, but it is cool nonetheless whenever there are explanations of the original language words, especially words that don't have a one-to-one correspondence in English. Super helpful in a study Bible. Now, when we come to Genesis, the notes come from a broadly evangelical perspective, but they take more of a literary and historical and contextual approach than a scientific approach. So you don't see any young earth creationism. The notes really tend to focus more on the theological, the literary, the historical background of the text, And where there are differences of opinion among scholars, they give them to you. Let me give you an example. Genesis 9, the incident with Noah after the flood, he plants a vineyard, he gets drunk, and then something happens in his tent. And he wakes up and he's angry, and so he curses Ham, or Ham's son, Canaan. Actually, it's not the curse of Ham, it's the curse of Canaan. And he curses Canaan and his descendants, and it's just a strange passage. And so commentators have taken different approaches to it. I'll read this particular note because it gives you a good idea of how the Faithlife Study Bible handles such instances when they come to them throughout the text. It says, 2 difficult interpretive issues arise in the incident between Ham and Noah. Understanding the nature of Ham's offense and making sense of why Ham's son Canaan was cursed instead of Ham. See the note on verse 25. The text of 9:22 may be literally rendered as Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. However, this could be an idiom. It may not be about Noah being nude, but an incident that greatly insults Noah. Ham's offense could be explained as voyeurism, castration of Noah, sodomy, or incestuous rape of his mother. The voyeurism view is often defended by what Ham's brothers, Shem and Japheth, do in the wake of the incident. They walk backwards into the tent and cover their father's nakedness. This act doesn't explain the offense, though. It simply shows their respect for their father. There's no Old Testament prohibition against seeing one's father naked, so this interpretation would have likely been foreign to the original reader. Likewise, no such prohibition appears elsewhere in the ancient Near East law. Against the idea that Ham's offense was voyeurism, the Hebrew phrase, which may be literally rendered saw the nakedness, appears elsewhere in the Old Testament referring to illicit sexual contact and intercourse. To see, ra'ah in Hebrew, the nakedness, erva in Hebrew, of someone is used in the law, Leviticus 18 and 20, to prohibit certain sexual relations. This idiom suggests that Ham's offense may have been of a sexual nature, perhaps homosexual rape of his father or paternal incest. However, no combination of the relevant Hebrew words ra'ah, see, galah, uncover, and erva, nakedness, occurs in the Old Testament in reference to homosexuality. The Hebrew phrase for uncovering the nakedness of a man actually refers to sexual intercourse with a man's wife. For example, in a literal rendering of Leviticus 18:7, the nakedness of your father means the nakedness of your mother. In Leviticus 18:14, a literal rendering of the nakedness of your father's brother is clarified as his wife and your aunt. Although the usual expression in Leviticus is to uncover, galah in Hebrew, the nakedness, both idioms are used in parallel in Leviticus 20:17. Therefore, Ham's offense may have been maternal incest and forcible rape of his mother. This explains the curse of Ham's son that follows. See Genesis 9:25 through 27. Now, that's a long-winded note, but the reason that I wanted to show it is because it does what a good study Bible should do. It presents the options. It gives the basic reasoning why interpreters take some of the different approaches that they do. And then it presents what it thinks is the most likely interpretation. In this case, that the incident between Ham and Noah did not have to do with Ham just looking at his father passed out drunk, but actually went and uncovered the nakedness of his father, which is a stock Hebrew idiom way of saying had sexual relations with his father's wife. Whether you agree or not with that particular interpretation, it gives you the why they come to that conclusion rather than just saying scholars believe this. Same thing when you come to Exodus. When it comes to the Exodus and the question of where was Yam Suf, where was the Red Sea, they mention the arguments. The biblical argument is why some people say this Yam Suf is the Gulf of Aqaba, because in the Bible, Yam Suf is where Solomon kept his ships. But it also notes that if Suf means reeds, reeds don't grow in salt water, they grow in fresh water. And so it would have referred to some marshy or some semi-salty body of water where at least reeds could grow. And they allow you to make up your mind based on your reading of the text. The illustrations in Exodus are really good. Here's one of the different types of chariots that would have pursued the Israelites. Here we have the furnishings of the tabernacle, as well as an overview of what the tabernacle itself would have looked like. And at the end of Exodus, there's a short article by Tim Keller on the place of law for Christians today. And it helps put into context the book that you've just read. And as you turn the page to Leviticus, all the things you're going to read about the laws of Israel's covenant and what place do they have for modern Christians today. Why don't we just skip this book? Great discussion by Keller on why we shouldn't. When we come to Romans, in the first sentence in the book of Romans, introduction is beautiful. It nails it. It says, in his letter to the Roman church, Paul lays out his argument for unifying Jews and non-Jews in Christ, and in the process instructs his readers on how to restore their relationship with God. As Paul explains, we only find unity with God and with one another through God's Son, Jesus Christ. Christ represents the fulfillment of God's covenant promises going all the way back to Abraham. Paul proclaims that Christ is the very righteousness of God and the means for us sinners to become righteous, to be saved. That's a great way to introduce because it hits some of the major points. If you're from the Reformed or the more traditional readings of Romans, you want to know it's about righteousness, it's about being saved, it's about justification, it's about all these, quote, doctrines of grace that Reformed people really like. But from a literary perspective, it starts by noting Paul's reason for writing Romans was in large part, because of the division and the tension that Jewish and non-Jewish followers of Jesus were experiencing as they're trying to coexist together, which is part of the socio-rhetorical background of Romans. And other commentators like Ben Witherington and N.T. Wright and others have noted that plays a big part in why Paul argues the way he does and why he constructs what is basically an 11-chapter discourse on the history of God's salvation between Jew and Gentile, then followed by the outworking of all of that in the ethical exhortation at the end of Romans. So this introduction, it's not very long. There's, 2-3 pages. It gives you a very short, 6-point outline, but the little bit that you do get is very good. Then when we get to the questions in chapters 7 about who is the I in Romans, it notes both ways of reading. The traditional reading that the I is Paul talking about his ongoing struggle with sin, and the older reading that goes back to the Greek-speaking church fathers, which was, no, the I of Romans 7 is not Paul. It's Paul taking on the persona of someone apart from the Spirit who is grappling with and ultimately realizing he cannot overcome the sinful nature. Same thing when you get to questions about predestination and election in chapter 9, or who is Israel, the all Israel will be saved in chapter 11. The notes give you the different views, and then it's up to you to see where do you land. And lastly, we come to Revelation. Once again, the introduction to Revelation. It's not very long. It's only 2 or 3 pages, but the opening lines of the introduction crush it. It says, Revelation draws back the curtain on the unseen realities of life for God's people. There's a spiritual battle going on, and the risen Jesus reveals these visions to John so that God's church will be aware of what's happening now and in the future. While the strange imagery might seem frightening, the ultimate message of Revelation is a hopeful one. Although evil appears to triumph, God remains on the throne. That is a fantastic introduction to the book of Revelation. Every word in that introduction could be unpacked in terms of theological meaning. There's even a word play when he says Revelation draws back the curtain. Guess what? That's what the word apocalypsis in Greek actually means. To reveal, to draw back the curtain. That's where the word revelation comes from. Now, if revelation intrigues you or scares you or gives you anxiety or you just don't know what to do with it, go ahead and click this link right here. And you can do our free course here at Disciple Dojo, Revelation, a guided tour of the apocalypse. We walk chapter by chapter through the entire book, and we pull back the curtain. We show you how Revelation communicates this exact message to God's people. So they don't take a futurist approach. If anything, the notes and the introduction leans to what is called the idealist approach of the 4 different ways of reading Revelation. But here's a full 2-page spread on how each of those different interpretive views reads these events throughout Revelation. And then when we come to the millennium in chapter 20, once again, you have all of the millennial views and a chart of how they interpret this events of chapter 20. So the notes on Revelation, I cannot speak highly enough in the Faithlife Study Bible about how well they've handled both Romans and Revelation. So would I recommend the Faithlife Study Bible? Yes, but here's my qualification. Unless you just need a Bible to hold in your hand, I would not recommend buying the print version. It's good. I'm not saying you shouldn't have it. What I'm saying is the digital version, the app-based version, whether it's on a tablet or on your phone, I think would be the way to go. The app version has all of the notes and they're clickable, and you can pair them with whatever translation you prefer. You like the New American Standard? Cool. Put that on the left column. Boom, there are your notes from Faithlife right there. Because again, the notes in the Faithlife Study Bible are not keyed to any particular translation. They are notes on the original language. And that to me is the greatest strength of the Faithlife Study Bible. And that they're broad notes that present both perspectives, or sometimes even 2 or 3 perspectives, and then lets you decide. To me, that makes the notes in the Faithlife Study Bible probably, arguably at this point, the best study Bible notes out there. I would say that. I'll go on record and say the Faithlife Study Bible notes, just the notes, are the best study notes out there in terms of understanding the text. Now, Bibles like Life Application are probably the best notes out there for helping you interpret and then apply the text. I still think Life App is my go-to recommendation. Click this video if you want to see why. For people who just want to better understand and live out the Bible. But for people who are taking a step beyond that and who are like, I want to study and I want to know what the text says, the Faithlife Study Bible notes are the best study Bible notes that I've seen. And the fact that you can get them on the app, or if you have Logos, you can have them in your Logos library right alongside all of your other resources. You should get a digital copy, or again, if you're a paper snob, get the printed copy. Thanks for watching. Happy Bible reading, and we'll see you next time in our next Bible review.